When you picture a traditional Jedi, you see a monk, calm, detached, perfected through decades of quiet solitude. Luke, on the other hand, was very impulsive, restless, easily blinded by anger, and fiercely tied to the people he loved. By every single rule written in the ancient archives, Luke was entirely unfit to carry a lightsaber or to be a Jedi. Yet, he did what the ancient order could never do. He brought down the galactic empire. And Luke didn't save the galaxy by erasing who he was or numbing his own heart or thoughts. He didn't simply win by being a cold, numb weapon. From his humble beginnings as a farm boy on Tatooine to someone who trusted his instincts over a computer inside the Death Star. So Luke was always defined by his raw personality and nature. When he faced Darth Vader, he carried all his human flaws, his grief, and his immense attachment to everybody around him. Now, this creates a deep contradiction. If Luke failed every single test in the ancient rulebook, how did he become the ultimate Jedi? So, and that also raises a question: was the old order wrong, or did they simply forgot what was a Jedi ever meant to be? To understand Luke's victory, we have to look at the ruins of the ancient Jedi Order. So, most people will tell you that the Jedi fell because of the Sith, because of Palpatine, or because of Order 66. But I think the truth is far tragic and far quieter than what we think. The Order didn't die when its temple was burned. Its downfall began years earlier, the moment the High Council mistook rigid rules for true wisdom and emotional apathy for genuine peace. In the final days of the Republic, the Council grew terrified of the dark side. But instead of teaching their students how to understand and how to navigate their human feelings, they chose total suppression. They treated fear, grief, and love like an infectious disease. Their solution was simple and severe: do not feel, do not bond, do not care too deeply. They called this detachment. But I think of human emotions as a vast, powerful river. The council tried to build a massive stone dam to block the water, believing that if they locked their hearts behind a rigid rulebook, they would be safe. But forcing a river back doesn't make the water disappear. It only builds up unbearable pressure under the surface until the entire structure collapses. This was Anakin's tragedy because the Order treated love as a forbidden crime. Anakin had to hide his deepest feelings in the dark, where his fear of loss rotted into obsession, paranoia, and rage. The Council fell into a fatal trap. They confused selfless love with possessive attachment. Possession comes from a fear. I love, so I must control, because I cannot accept losing. That path leads to the dark side. But selfless compassion, on the other hand, says I love, but I do not own. The council was so terrified of possessive darkness that they outlawed simple, selfless love right along with it. They built walls around themselves, but in doing so, they completely forgot that why they existed in the first place and how they were isolating themselves. This brings us to the climax of the original trilogy and how Luke changed the universe. So, when Luke faced the Emperor in the second Death Star, he wasn't just standing between two men with lightsabers. He was standing between a crossroad of two failing worldviews, both demanding that he shed blood. On one side, he had Palpatine, who was urging Luke to strike down Vader out of pure hatred, revenge, and anger, the path of the Sith, where emotion is weaponized to dominate others. On the other side stood the memories of Yoda and Obi-Wan. The last masters of the old order wasn't evil, but they were trapped in the pessimistic logic of their past failures. To them, the equation was cold and simple. Vader was a Sith, the Sith were irredeemable evil, and therefore Vader had to be executed. They did not see Anakin anymore. They saw a monster in armor. And they didn't train Luke to save his father, they trained him to finish him. If Luke had delivered the killing blow, he might have pleased his masters, but he would have completely failed as a spiritual being. He would have simply restarted the same old dogmatic cycle that destroyed the Jedi in the first place. But instead, Luke did something revolutionary. He rejected both choices. With Vader beaten on the floor, helpless and bleeding, Luke looked down at his mechanical arm and then at his father's prosthetic arm. In that silence, Luke realized the terrible truth that if he struck Vader down, he would complete his own transformation into the very monster he was trying to defeat. He felt anger, pain, fear, all that emotions the old council feared, but he refused to let them dictate his soul. Luke didn't win by unleashing destructive power. He won by throwing his weapon away. When he stepped back and declared, I am a Jedi like my father before me, he broke the ancient cycle. He refused to look at his father through a rule book. He met Vader's violence with unconditional mercy. That single act of non violence shattered decades of corruption inside Anakin. Anakin, at the end, wasn't saved by an ancient code. He was saved because his son was brave enough to set that dogma aside and to listen to his heart and love him unconditionally. In that single moment, Luke didn't just save his father. I think he restored the true soul of the Jedi. And I think there is a beautiful truth at the center of the saga. You can burn every temple to the ground. You can shatter every lightsaber, erase every holocron, and execute every master who carries the Jedi title. But you cannot kill the Jedi way. Because the Jedi way was never invented by an institution, it was discovered in nature. Think of it. Think of it like a fundamental law of reality. The truth doesn't exist because a book was written. The book was written because the truth was already there. If every sacred text on earth was, let's say, burnt today, someone 1,000 years from now, sitting in his room, might observe the same natural world and would eventually discover those exact same truths all over again. I think in that universe, the force works the same way. It isn't a weapon or something like a property owned by a religious council. It is a living energy of life itself. The Sith looked at this cosmic river and tried to force it using ego and violence. The ancient council tried to build a dam around it by making rigid rules and suppressing their emotions. But a true Jedi simply learns how to swim within the current and living with awareness, balance, and harmony. This is why the extension of the Jedi is an illusion. Even if the galaxy falls into total darkness, the truth remains waiting in silence. A child on a distant, forgotten planet who simply listens to the wind, who simply feels genuine empathy for other creatures, and who steps forward to protect the defenseless without asking for anything in return is practicing the Jedi way, even if he had never heard the word Jedi in his entire life. To be a Jedi is not about holding a title, wearing a robe, or belonging to a council. It is about how you choose to treat living organisms around you. Because institutions collapse, empires crumble, and code becomes obsolete. But empathy, selflessness, and the desire to protect life are woven into the very fabric of existence. You cannot extinguish something that is part of nature itself. And even with the old masters like Yoda and Obi-Wan, we see that they are trapped in shame and by trauma. To them, Anakin was a personal failure, a monster, and a lost cause because they could not forgive him. Because forgiving him meant confronting their own failures. However, Luke was not burdened by those institutional shame. He chose forgiveness, like radical forgiveness, forgiving a man who severed his hand, who killed his guardians, and terrorized the galaxy. That act of grace is what ultimately defined him as a true Jedi. Because in the end, the fundamental difference between the ancient order and the new Jedi way comes down to a very single radical choice: the capacity to forgive. I mean, look at Obi Wan and Master Yoda. They were the greatest fighters and much more stronger than Luke, and they belonged to the old order. Yet they carried the unhealed trauma of a fallen council or a galaxy. To them, Anakin wasn't just an enemy, he was their deepest shame. Even Obi Wan declared that the man he loved like a brother was more machine now than man, twisted and evil. Yoda warned him that once you step into the dark side, it will guide your destiny forever. They refused to forgive Anakin. They wrote him off as a lost cause. blinded by a pragmatic fatalism that declared some souls are simply beyond redeeming or beyond saving. And by human standards, they were right. Darth Vader had committed unforgivable atrocities. Luke had every reason to hate him because this man, who murdered the only family he ever knew, severed his hand and hunted his friends across the galaxy. Luke looked at this monster and did the unthinkable. He offered unconditional forgiveness. Forgiveness is not something, and forgiveness is not passive, and it is not naive. It does not erase the past or excuse evil. Forgiveness is the ultimate act of spiritual strength. It is looking directly into the darkest, most broken parts of a person and choosing grace over violence or vengeance. When Luke threw his lightsaber away in the Emperor's room, he did more than just rejection of violence. It was an act of radical forgiveness. Before Anakin had even apologized, before he had earned redemption, Luke forgave him anyway. He looked past that terrifying black mask and past that horrible body and saw his father, a broken human being still worthy of love in his eyes. That forgiveness did what decades of lightsaber battles and ancient dogmas could never achieve. It shattered the hold of the dark side from Anakin. Anakin didn't turn back to the light because he was defeated by a superior warrior. He turned back because his son's forgiveness reminded him of who he used to be. The old Jedi Order believed a Jedi was forged through decades of rigid discipline, emotional suppression, and flawless adherence to their rules. Luke proved them wrong. A true Jedi is not defined by the ability to conquer an enemy or their refusal to feel anything. A Jedi is defined by the capacity to forgive, to redeem, to have compassion for others. Because temples may crumble, codes may be forgotten, and institutions will always fall. But as long as there is one soul brave enough to put down their weapons and look into the dark side and offer grace instead of hatred, the Jedi way will live forever.